The briefing room at Naval Air Station Oceana fell silent when she walked in. Captain Maya Reeves moved with the kind of quiet precision that made seasoned officers pause mid-sentence, her flight suit bearing the faded patches of squadrons most pilots only read about in classified after-action reports. She carried a tablet under one arm and nothing else. No bravado, no introduction, just the weight of someone who had learned long ago that competence required no announcement. The Admiral seated at the head of the table, Rear Admiral Marcus Holt, SEAL Team veteran turned Aviation Command, watched her approach with the calculating gaze of a man who had spent 3 decades reading people in situations where misreading cost lives. His eyes tracked the way she moved, the slight favor of her left leg, the unconscious way her right hand stayed near her hip, muscle memory from carrying a sidearm in places where relaxation meant death. The other pilots in the room, 11 men ranging from cocky lieutenants to weathered commanders, exchanged glances that contained entire conversations about gender, capability, and the unspoken hierarchies that governed naval aviation. She took the empty seat at the far end of the table without waiting for invitation. "Captain Reeves reporting as requested, sir," she said, her voice carrying the flat professionalism of someone who had learned to strip emotion from communication, because emotion got people killed. Admiral Holt nodded once, then gestured to the lieutenant beside him, who dimmed the lights and brought up a satellite image on the screen behind them. It showed a coastal region in the South China Sea, coordinates blacked out, but the tactical markers told the story clearly enough. A downed aircraft, enemy territory, narrow extraction window. "We have a pilot down in a denied area," Holt began, his voice carrying the kind of controlled urgency that suggested the situation had already moved past the planning phase into the execution countdown. FA-18 Super Hornet, Callsign Vandal 23, ejected approximately 40 minutes ago following surface-to-air missile engagement. Current intel suggests he's mobile, conscious, and evading, but the window for extraction is closing rapidly. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Maya. "This is a volunteer-only operation. High risk, limited support, and the kind of political complications that mean if something goes wrong, official acknowledgement will be delayed at best." The room remained quiet, but Maya could feel the calculations happening around her, the mental arithmetic every combat pilot performed when presented with a mission that existed in the gray space between heroism and suicide. She had done this arithmetic so many times it no longer required conscious thought. Her hand moved to the pen clipped to her flight suit, a small gesture, but Holt caught it. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, recognition passing behind his eyes like distant lightning. He had read her file, she realized. He knew. "I'll fly it," Maya said, her voice cutting through the silence with the finality of a blade finding its sheath. The lieutenant to Holt's left, a fresh-faced officer whose name tape read Patterson, actually laughed, a short bark of disbelief quickly stifled when he caught the Admiral's expression. "Captain Reeves has more combat hours in denied airspace than anyone currently stationed at Oceana," Holt said, his tone suggesting the matter was concluded before the objection fully formed. "She'll fly lead in an A-10 Thunderbolt providing close air support and extraction cover. Lieutenant Commander Bryce, you'll fly wing in a second Warthog. The operation launches in 90 minutes. The room erupted in controlled chaos, officers moving toward their designated preparation areas, but Maya remained seated, her eyes fixed on the satellite image. She could see it already, the way the mission would unfold, the terrain features that would provide cover or create fatal funnels, the likely positions of enemy air defense systems, the narrow margin between success and becoming another grid coordinate on a classified recovery map. Admiral Holt approached as the others filed out, his footsteps deliberate against the polished floor. He stood beside her chair, not quite at attention but carrying himself with the bearing of someone who understood that rank was performance, not decoration. "Your call sign," he said quietly, the question implicit in the statement. Maya looked up at him, and for the first time since entering the room, Something flickered in her expression, a ghost of the person who existed beneath the tactical mask. "Requiem," she said. "They called me Requiem." Holt nodded slowly, processing the weight of that designation, understanding that call signs in the Special Operations aviation community were never chosen lightly, never given for skill alone. They were earned in moments that broke something fundamental in a person, moments that left marks deeper than any physical wound. "The pilot we're extracting," he continued, pulling a folder from under his arm and setting it on the table between them. "Lieutenant Jake Cordell, 28 years old, 2 deployments, solid pilot but green where it counts." Maya opened the folder, scanning the brief biography, the service record that showed competence without distinction, potential without proof. Standard officer, standard trajectory, the kind of pilot who flew by the book because he had never been in situations where the book became irrelevant. She had been that pilot once before Kandahar, before the mission that had transformed Captain Maya Reeves into Requiem. "He's got a wife," Holt added, tapping the photograph clipped inside the folder. 8 months pregnant with their first child. She's in the waiting room at Walter Reed right now, watching the news channels that aren't reporting what actually happened, knowing enough to be terrified and not enough to be prepared. Maya closed the folder, the gesture decisive. This was the manipulation, she knew, the emotional lever that commanders learned to pull when they needed someone to fly into situations that survival instinct screamed against. But it was also the truth, and truth had a weight that manipulation could never fully replicate. She stood, tucking the folder under her arm. "I'll need 15 minutes with the Warthog crew chief," she said. "I want munitions load verified personally, not just signed off. And I need current weather data for the target area, not the forecast, actual ground reports if we have assets that can provide them." Holt smiled slightly, the expression containing approval and something darker, the recognition of a kindred spirit who understood that survival in their profession required paranoia elevated to art form. "Crew Chief Ramirez is already prepping your aircraft," he said. "Tell number 643, the one you flew on your last deployment. He kept it maintained to your specifications." That stopped her, the unexpected consideration, the small gesture that acknowledged continuity in a profession built on transience and loss. She had flown 643 through missions that still appeared in her dreams with the clarity of immediate memory, had trusted that aircraft with her life when trust was the only currency that mattered. "Thank you, sir," she said, and meant it. Holt watched her move toward the door, then called out just as she reached it. "Requiem," he said, using the call sign deliberately. She turned, one hand on the door frame. "Why did they call you that?" She was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant, seeing something beyond the briefing room walls, beyond the present moment entirely. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet devastation of someone recounting events that had fundamentally altered their understanding of the world. "Because I was the only one who came back," she said. "Because I had to write the music for the ones who didn't." She left before he could respond, the door closing behind her with the soft finality of a coffin lid. Admiral Holt stood alone in the empty briefing room, the satellite image still glowing on the screen, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of a decision that might have been wrong, that might have sent someone toward a fate they had already survived once and should never have been asked to face again. The flight line at Oceana existed in perpetual controlled chaos, aircraft moving along taxiways with the ponderous grace of enormous predators, ground crews weaving between them with the practiced confidence of people who understood that complacency killed faster than enemy action. Maya walked past a row of FA-18 Super Hornets, their sleek profiles engineered for speed and precision, aircraft built for the kind of warfare that happened at altitudes and velocities that turned combat into mathematics. She had flown Hornets early in her career, had loved the responsive handling and technological superiority, but she had learned in places where technology failed and mathematics became irrelevant that survival often required something more primitive, something the Warthog understood in its very design. The A-10 Thunderbolt II waiting at the end of the flight line looked like exactly what it was. A flying gun platform designed by engineers who understood that close air support meant descending into the envelope, where small arms fire and portable missiles turned the sky into a killing field requiring armor, redundancy, and the kind of brutish survivability that fighter aircraft disdained. Crew Chief Ramirez saw her approaching and straightened from his inspection of the port engine, his weathered face creasing into an expression that contained greeting and assessment in equal measure. He had maintained aircraft for 18 years, had learned to read pilots the way mechanics read engine sounds, understanding that the human component was often more unpredictable and potentially catastrophic than any mechanical system. "Captain Reeves," he said, the formal address carrying warmth that informality would have diminished. "643 is ready for you. I've personally verified the GAU-8 ammunition feed, checked the Maverick missile targeting systems, and the countermeasure dispensers are loaded with updated chaff and flare configurations based on the latest threat assessments from the region." Maya approached the aircraft, her hand trailing along the fuselage in an unconscious gesture that was part inspection, part communion with a machine that had kept her alive when survival seemed like a mathematical improbability. The Warthog's titanium bathtub surrounding the cockpit bore scars from previous engagements, patched and reinforced but never fully erased, a history written in repaired damage. "What's the hydraulic redundancy status?" she asked, her eyes tracking along the twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, positioning designed to reduce infrared signature and allow operation from rough forward bases where foreign object debris would destroy conventional engine configurations. Ramirez consulted the tablet in his hands, pulling up the detailed maintenance logs. All three hydraulic systems showing optimal pressure and fluid levels. The flight control system has full manual reversion capability tested within the last 48 hours. Even if you take catastrophic damage to two systems, you'll still have enough control authority to bring her home. Maya nodded, appreciating the precision of the report, understanding that Ramirez spoke from experience that included recovering aircraft that had limped back to base with damage that should have made flight impossible. The Warthog had a reputation for survivability that bordered on legend. Stories of pilots landing with missing sections of wing, destroyed engines, hydraulic systems reduced to memory and prayer. She intended to preserve that reputation. Lieutenant Commander Nathan Bryce appeared from around the nose of the adjacent Warthog, his flight suit crisp in a way that suggested limited exposure to the realities that made uniform maintenance a low priority. He was younger than Maya by perhaps 5 years, carried himself with the confident swagger of someone whose competence had never been truly tested, never pushed beyond the parameters of controlled training scenarios into the chaos where plans dissolved and instinct determined outcome. "Captain Reeves," he said, extending a hand that she shook with professional courtesy. "Looking forward to flying with you. I've heard the stories about your service record, though I have to admit, most of them seem a bit embellished." There it was, the casual dismissal wrapped in compliment, the suggestion that her reputation existed more in mythology than reality. Maya had encountered this attitude countless times, had learned that responding with anger or defensiveness only confirmed suspicions about emotional control and professional capability. Instead, she smiled slightly, the expression containing no warmth. "Stories tend to simplify what actually happened," she said. "Reality is usually messier and less heroic than the version that gets repeated." Bryce laughed, the sound carrying the artificial heartiness of someone uncomfortable with ambiguity. "Well, hopefully this extraction stays in the simple category. Get in, pick up our pilot, get out before the bad guys figure out what's happening." Maya glanced toward the horizon, where afternoon sun painted the ocean in shades of bronze and shadow, beautiful in the way that concealed the violence occurring beneath surfaces, the constant predation that made the sea simultaneously magnificent and merciless. "Hope isn't a strategy," she said quietly, "but it's what we have when strategy fails." She climbed the crew ladder attached to 643's fuselage, settling into the cockpit with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom every movement had been optimized through repetition. The seat molded around her, the controls falling naturally under her hands, switches and displays arranged in the familiar configuration that her fingers could navigate without visual confirmation. She ran through the pre-flight checklist with Ramirez calling confirmations from the ground, each item verified and acknowledged. The twin turbofan engine spooled to life with the distinctive whine that always reminded Maya of something enormous taking a deep breath before exertion. She felt the vibration through the airframe, the subtle feedback that told her the aircraft was mechanically sound, ready for whatever demands the next hours would impose. The radio crackled in her helmet as tower control cleared her for taxi. Oceana Tower, Requiem 11 requesting taxi for immediate departure, flight of 2, combat tasking. The controller's response came with the clipped professionalism that suggested he understood the nature of their mission without requiring details. Requiem flight, cleared to taxi runway 23, winds 240 at 12 knots, altimeter 3012. Maya acknowledged, releasing brakes and feeling the Warthog roll forward with the ponderous momentum that always made her think of glaciers, slow to start but carrying inexorable force once in motion. Bryce's aircraft fell into formation behind her, maintaining the proper spacing for flight operations. As they taxied past the main operations building, Maya saw Admiral Holt standing at a window on the upper floor, his silhouette framed against interior lighting. They reached the runway threshold, and Maya brought 643 to a halt, running final checks while Tower cleared them for immediate departure. The mission clock began its countdown in her head, the autonomous calculation that every combat pilot developed, understanding that time was both resource and enemy, simultaneously precious and antagonistic. Requiem 2, radio check, she transmitted to Bryce. Requiem 11, I've got you loud and clear, he responded. Ready when you are. Maya advanced the throttles, feeling 8,000 pounds of thrust push the Warthog down the runway with acceleration that seemed leisurely compared to fighter aircraft, but possessed its own inexorable authority. The nose wheel lifted, then the main separated from concrete, and they were airborne, climbing into an afternoon sky that promised nothing except the opportunity to test whether skill and luck could once again align in the narrow intersection where survival lived. The coastline fell away beneath them, familiar geography giving way to open ocean, the transition that always reminded Maya of crossing from the known into possibility. The aircraft settled into cruise configuration, engines throttled back to conserve fuel for the hours ahead. Maya checked her tactical display, confirming their flight path would take them east across the Atlantic before turning south toward the target area, a route calculated to minimize detection by surveillance systems that watched the obvious approaches with automated diligence. The radio remained quiet except for occasional position reports, the professional silence of people understanding that unnecessary communication increased risk without providing benefit. She thought about Lieutenant Cordell, somewhere on the ground in hostile territory, hearing sounds of pursuit, and understanding that rescue was theoretical until it manifested as physical reality. She had been that person once, had spent 36 hours evading capture after her Super Hornet took catastrophic damage over Kandahar, ejecting into terrain that maps designated as contested but which reality transformed into actively lethal. The memory existed in her body more than her mind, muscle knowledge of fear and exhaustion, pushed beyond limits she had believed absolute. 2 hours into the flight, the tactical net crackled with an update from the Combat Operations Center. Requiem flight, be advised, enemy air defense systems in the target area have increased activity in the last 30 minutes. We're observing radar emissions consistent with search patterns, suggest they're aware an asset is in the area and are actively hunting. Maya acknowledged the transmission, her hands automatically adjusting trim and scanning instruments while her mind processed the implications. Increased air defense activity meant the window for extraction was narrowing faster than planned, meant that the element of surprise they had hoped to maintain was potentially already compromised. She glanced at her fuel gauge, calculating the revised timeline against consumption rates and the critical point where continuation became commitment and return became mathematically impossible. Requiem 2, we're going to need to compress our approach timeline, she transmitted to Bryce. That means coming in lower and faster than the original plan specified. Stay tight on my wing and watch for ground fire. Copy that lead, Bryce responded, his voice carrying slightly less swagger than before, reality beginning to assert itself against confidence. The sun had descended toward the horizon by the time they approached the target area, evening light painting the ocean in layers of copper and shadow that made visual navigation simultaneously easier and more deceptive. Maya descended to 500 feet above the water, low enough that radar returns mixed with surface clutter, and made tracking more difficult for automated systems. The Warthog handled the low-altitude buffeting with its characteristic stability, engineered for exactly this kind of terrain-hugging flight that exposed pilots to ground fire but reduced detection range. The coastline appeared ahead, a dark line separating water from land, and beyond it, the terrain that held both a downed pilot and the forces hunting him. Maya felt her breathing slow, her heart rate decrease, the parasympathetic response that combat veterans developed, body understanding that panic consumed oxygen and mental processing capacity that survival required elsewhere. Requiem Flight, Snake Eyes has your pilot's position, the Combat Operations Center transmitted, using the call sign for the reconnaissance asset tracking Cordell's movements. He's mobile, currently moving northeast approximately 2 kilometers from his ejection point. Multiple hostile patrols in the area, closest approximately 800 meters south of his position and closing. Recommend immediate extraction before the search pattern contracts further. Maya acknowledged, already adjusting course toward the coordinates scrolling across her tactical display. She could visualize the terrain from the satellite images studied during mission brief, understanding that 2 kilometers in dense vegetation with hostile patrols meant Cordell was running a race against systematically shrinking space, each moment reducing his options until geometry left none. The aircraft crossed the coastline at 300 knots, terrain rising abruptly from sea level, forcing her to climb while remaining below the radar horizon that would expose them to the full air defense network. She could see the landscape beneath them now, vegetation dark in fading light, occasional structures marking settlements, roads cutting through terrain like scars. Requiem 11 is in country, she transmitted, the understated acknowledgement that they had crossed the threshold from international airspace into denied territory, where their presence constituted violation subject to lethal response. Bryce's aircraft maintained formation off her right wing, close enough that she could see his helmet moving as he scanned the darkening sky, situational awareness reducing to the narrow cone that instruments and vision could maintain. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon in the Warthog's nose carried 1,100 rounds of 30mm ammunition, each projectile capable of destroying armored vehicles or transforming personnel into statistical abstractions. Maya had fired the weapon in combat, knew the sound it made, a mechanical roar that resonated through the airframe and temporarily deafened despite hearing protection, knew the effect on targets below, the physics of high-velocity impacts that didn't just destroy but erased. Snake Eyes, Requiem 11, requesting pilot's current position and immediate threat assessment, she transmitted. The response came from an analyst thousands of miles away, staring at screens that transformed infrared signatures and radar returns into actionable intelligence. Requiem, pilot, is approximately 3 kilometers northeast of your current position, moving at approximately 6 kilometers per hour through heavy vegetation. We have multiple hostile elements converging from south and west, closest group now within 500 meters and closing. You have maybe 10 minutes before the search pattern tightens enough that extraction becomes non-viable. 10 minutes was simultaneously forever and no time at all, Maya knew, the paradox of combat that compressed and expanded temporal experience until clock time became irrelevant and only sequence mattered. She increased speed, the warthog accelerating with the reluctant momentum that characterized its responses, not graceful but effective. The target coordinates appeared on her heads-up display, overlaying physical terrain with digital representation, the fusion that modern warfare required, simultaneous operation in multiple realities. "I've got smoke," Bryce transmitted suddenly. 3 o'clock low, approximately 2 kilometers. Maya banked right, acquiring the visual reference, seeing the dark column rising from terrain below, suggesting either vehicle fire or deliberate signal. The smoke could be Cordell attempting to mark his position, or hostile forces establishing a command point, ambiguity that required resolution before commitment. "Snake Eyes, can you confirm smoke signature source?" she asked. Seconds of silence followed, the delay that suggested the analyst was refining sensor data or consulting additional sources. "Negative confirmation, Requiem. Smoke signature is outside our current sensor coverage area. Advise caution." Caution meant maintaining altitude and standoff distance, meant avoiding potential traps that enemy forces established when they understood extraction was imminent. But caution also meant time, and time was the resource they lacked. Maya made the calculation that had no right answer, only consequences. Requiem 2, maintain current altitude and position. "I'm descending for visual confirmation." She pushed the stick forward before Bryce could respond, diving toward the smoke with speed building rapidly. The ground rose to meet her with the apparent acceleration that perspective created, details emerging from abstraction, individual trees and structures becoming distinct as altitude decreased. She leveled off at 200 feet, low enough that she could see a dirt road cutting through vegetation, a burned-out technical vehicle still smoking at the roadside. And there, scrambling through underbrush near the tree line, a figure in a flight suit waving frantically. Maya keyed the radio, "Snake Eyes, I have visual confirmation on pilot, approximately 300 meters north of the smoke source. Pilot is mobile and appears uninjured, standing by for extraction guidance." The analyst's response carried controlled urgency. "Requiem, hostile patrol approximately 400 meters southeast of pilot position and closing rapidly. You have maybe 5 minutes before contact becomes inevitable. We're detecting increased radio traffic in the area, suggesting they've spotted your aircraft. 5 minutes to extract a pilot from dense terrain while under active pursuit by hostile forces with air defense capabilities, positioned to engage aircraft operating at extraction altitudes." Maya pulled up sharply, climbing back toward Bryce's position while her mind processed options with the rapid calculation that training and experience created. Traditional helicopter extraction was non-viable, too slow and too vulnerable. They would need to improvise, use the Warthog's capabilities in ways not covered by standard procedures. "Requiem 2, come left to heading 045 and descend to my altitude," she transmitted. "We're going to use the cannon to create a clearing and suppression fire to keep the hostiles pinned while the extraction element moves in." Bryce's response carried uncertainty. "Lead, the extraction element is still 30 minutes out. What are we extracting him with?" Maya didn't answer immediately, still working through the tactical problem, understanding that she was proposing something without precedent, something that would either become a case study in innovation or a cautionary tale about desperation masquerading as strategy. "We're going to land," she said finally, the words carrying the weight of decision. "One of us maintains air cover while the other puts down on that dirt road, loads the pilot, and gets airborne before the hostiles overrun the position." The radio silence that followed spoke volumes, Bryce processing implications that included violation of multiple regulations, exposure to catastrophic risk, and the kind of career consequences that came from actions that failed to achieve their objectives. But silence also meant he hadn't refused, hadn't dismissed the plan as impossible. "You want me to land?" he asked finally. Maya checked her fuel gauge, calculated time on station versus requirements for the return flight, understanding that margins were already thin and about to become thinner. "Negative. I'll take the landing," she said. "You've got more fuel remaining, which means you can maintain air cover longer. I'll put down, load the pilot, and get airborne. You keep anything hostile away from that road for the 30 seconds we'll be vulnerable." Bryce acknowledged. The transmission clipped, suggesting he understood the mathematics that made Maya expendable in ways that his greater fuel reserve did not. She didn't resent the calculation. She had made similar assessments countless times, understanding that sentiment was luxury that combat couldn't afford. She descended again, this time scanning the road for obstacles that would prevent landing or, more critically, takeoff. The burned technical vehicle sat approximately 200 meters from where the road straightened for perhaps 400 meters, long enough for the Warthog's short takeoff requirements if conditions aligned. The surface looked packed earth rather than pavement, which meant potential for debris or soft spots that could catch the nose wheel and transform landing into controlled crash. She had put down on worse surfaces, had operated from forward bases, where the runway designation was generous, and the margin for error was measured in inches rather than feet. "Requiem 11 is committing to landing," she transmitted, the formal announcement that served dual purpose of notifying Bryce and creating the radio record that would later be analyzed to determine whether her actions constituted heroism, recklessness, or the intersection where those concepts became indistinguishable. She configured the aircraft for landing, extending gear and reducing speed, feeling the Warthog's aerodynamics shift as it transformed from cruise to approach configuration. The road filled her windscreen, rushing toward her with the apparent speed that made every landing seem like controlled collision. She judged height and distance by instinct refined through thousands of repetitions, flaring at the last moment to bleed speed and settle the main gear onto packed earth with impact that rattled teeth and tested gear struts. The nose wheel came down, and she immediately applied brakes, feeling anti-lock systems cycle as they prevented skid while scrubbing speed. The Warthog decelerated with painful slowness, eating precious distance before finally rolling to a stop approximately 50 meters from where the road disappeared back into vegetation. Maya kept engines running, understanding that shutdown meant restart delay that could prove fatal, and popped the canopy. The sound of the world rushed in, replacing the filtered audio of the cockpit with unprocessed reality, wind and engine noise, and in the distance, voices shouting in a language she didn't speak but whose urgency required no translation. She unbuckled and stood in the cockpit, scanning the tree line where Cordell should be approaching, her hand moving to the sidearm holstered at her hip, muscle memory from deployments where the line between pilot and infantry blurred into whatever role kept you breathing. "Cordell," she shouted, projecting her voice toward the vegetation. "Get your ass to the road now." Movement in the underbrush, branches thrashing as someone moved without concern for stealth, and then he burst from the tree line, his flight suit torn and dirty, his face carrying the wide-eyed expression of someone running on adrenaline and shock. He saw the Warthog and his pace increased, scrambling toward the aircraft with the desperate momentum of someone understanding that salvation existed in reaching that cockpit before circumstances shifted. Maya waved him forward urgently, her eyes tracking past him toward the tree line where she could now see additional movement, figures appearing in the vegetation, hostile forces that had triangulated on their position and were closing. "Requiem 2, I've got hostiles emerging from the southern tree line approximately 300 meters from my position," she transmitted with controlled urgency. "Need immediate suppression on that position." Bryce's response came with the roar of his aircraft descending, the 30-millimeter cannon opening up with the distinctive sound that gave the Warthog its nickname, the BRRRT that resonated across distances and briefly transformed everything within its target area into physics experiment, demonstrating energy transfer principles. The tree line where hostile forces had been emerging exploded into chaos, vegetation shredded, and dirt geysering skyward as high-velocity rounds impacted at rates that created continuous rather than discrete destruction. Maya watched the effect with clinical appreciation, understanding that Bryce had just bought them perhaps 30 seconds before surviving hostiles reorganized or reinforcements arrived. Cordell reached the aircraft, gasping with exertion and fear, his hands scrambling for purchase on the fuselage. "Get behind the seat," Maya shouted, pointing to the narrow space behind the cockpit's ejection seat where maintenance personnel sometimes crouched during ground operations. Cordell looked at the space with disbelief, clearly understanding that it violated every safety regulation and common sense principle regarding aircraft occupancy. "That's not designed for flight," he shouted back. "Neither is crashing or getting captured," Maya responded, her voice carrying the flat authority that eliminated discussion. "Get in now or I'm leaving without you." That galvanized movement, Cordell hauling himself up the crew ladder with desperate effort, squeezing into the space behind the seat with contortions that suggested panic, made excellent motivation for flexibility. Maya didn't wait for confirmation he was secured, simply dropped back into her seat and pulled the canopy closed, sealing them in the cockpit while her hands moved across controls with practiced speed. The engines were already at idle, requiring only throttle advance and brake release to start their takeoff roll. She scanned the road ahead one final time, noting a slight depression approximately 200 meters distant that would require careful management during the acceleration, then released brakes. The Warthog lurched forward, acceleration building, with the same reluctant momentum that characterized its flight envelope, slow at first but accumulating, speed transforming into the velocity necessary for flight. Maya held the nose wheel on the ground, maximizing acceleration by keeping drag minimized, watching the airspeed indicator climb with what seemed like geological patience. 100 knots, 120, 140, the depression approaching rapidly, and she pulled back on the stick, lifting the nose just enough to clear the terrain irregularity without fully committing to flight. The aircraft bounced slightly as it hit the depression's far edge, gear struts compressing and releasing, but maintained contact with the road. 160 knots, approaching rotation speed, and movement in her peripheral vision made her glance left just as muzzle flashes erupted from the tree line, hostile forces emerging from the cover where Bryce's cannon fire had temporarily pinned them. She felt impacts against the airframe, heard the distinct sound of rounds penetrating aluminum, and the master caution light illuminated on her instrument panel. She pulled back harder on the stick, committing to flight regardless of speed, understanding that remaining on the ground meant becoming a stationary target for forces that were finding their range. The Warthog lifted reluctantly, main gear separating from the road's surface with barely enough velocity to sustain flight, climbing away at an angle that screamed marginal performance and probable stall. Maya held the aircraft in the narrow envelope between adequate airspeed and excessive angle of attack, coaxing altitude from physics that seemed reluctant to cooperate. "Requiem 11 is airborne," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the chaos of the last 90 seconds. "I've taken ground fire, assessing damage now." Behind her, she could hear Cordell breathing in ragged gasps, could feel him shifting in the inadequate space behind the seat. But he was alive, and that was sufficient until circumstances allowed more comprehensive concern. She scanned instruments, noting the master caution light was accompanied by hydraulic pressure indications showing System 2 at 0 and System 1 showing degraded pressure. The Warthog's triple redundant hydraulic system meant she still had flight control authority through the remaining system and manual reversion backup, but the degradation suggested damage that required assessment once they achieved safe altitude and distance from immediate threat. "Requiem 2, join on my right side and give me a visual inspection of damage," she transmitted to Bryce. His aircraft slid into formation, close enough that she could see his helmet as he maneuvered for better viewing angle. Several seconds passed while he conducted the inspection, his silence suggesting the findings were not encouraging. "Lead, you've got multiple punctures along your port side fuselage. Looks like small arms fire," he finally transmitted. "I can see fluid streaming from one of the impact points, probably hydraulic fluid. Your left elevator has visible damage. Looks like a round went clean through. I'd also recommend checking your fuel quantity. Some of those impacts are near the port tank." Maya checked the fuel gauge. Watching the needle descend faster than consumption rate alone would explain, confirming that at least one round had compromised fuel tank integrity. She did the mental arithmetic, calculating distance to friendly territory against current fuel state and consumption rate accelerated by the leak, understanding that the numbers were approaching the point where they wouldn't work, where physics would force her to make decisions between ditching at sea and attempting to reach land with fuel exhaustion imminent. "Snake Eyes, Requiem 1-1, she transmitted to the operations center. "I've taken damage and have compromised fuel state. Request immediate clearance for direct routing to nearest friendly field and emergency equipment standing by." The response came with practiced calm that suggested the analyst had expected complications. "Requiem, we're calculating routing options now. Stand by." Behind her, Cordell finally found his voice, the words coming out in a rush. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, this is all my fault. I should never have let myself get shot down. Lieutenant, I need you to be quiet now," Maya interrupted, her tone firm but not unkind. "You can process guilt later. Right now I need to focus on getting us both home." The operations center came back with routing, and as Maya feared, the mathematics were not favorable. "Requiem 1-1, nearest friendly field is Naval Air Station Sigonella in Sicily, approximately 400 nautical miles northwest of your current position. Current fuel state and observed consumption suggest you'll reach emergency fuel in approximately 30 minutes. Recommend you begin climb to optimize fuel consumption and prepare for possible controlled ditching if fuel exhaustion occurs before reaching land. 400 nautical miles with degraded hydraulics and leaking fuel, the kind of challenge that existed at the intersection of skill, luck, and the narrow margins that define survival at the edge of operational capability." Maya acknowledged the transmission and began a gradual climb, trading speed for altitude where the thinner air would reduce fuel consumption slightly, buying minutes that might prove critical. Bryce maintained formation, his presence both comfort and reminder that if she had to ditch, at least someone would know the location and could coordinate rescue. The sun had fully set now, darkness transforming the world below into abstraction punctuated by occasional lights, navigation reduced to instruments and radio guidance. "Requiem, be advised, we're detecting increased air defense radar activity in your area," the operations center transmitted. "Recommend you maintain low altitude despite fuel considerations until you clear their engagement envelope." The contradictory guidance captured the impossibility of their situation, simultaneously needing altitude for fuel efficiency and low altitude for survivability, unable to satisfy both requirements simultaneously. Maya chose survival over optimization, maintaining her current altitude while accepting that the decision made fuel exhaustion more probable. The minutes accumulated with agonizing slowness, each one marked by the fuel gauge needle creeping toward zero, each one representing distance covered toward safety that never seemed to grow closer. The hydraulic system one pressure continued its gradual decline, suggesting that while the leak wasn't catastrophic, it was persistent and eventually would reduce control authority to the point where precision flying became impossible. "How are you doing back there?" she asked Cordell, breaking the focused silence. "Uncomfortable and terrified but alive," he responded, his voice carrying shaky humor. "Is it always like this?" Maya thought about the question, about the missions that had blurred together into an accumulated experience of controlled chaos and narrow survival, about the ones that hadn't blurred, that remained distinct in memory with the clarity that trauma created. "No," she said finally. "Usually it's worse." That surprised a short laugh from him, the sound incongruous but human, a reminder that beneath the stress and fear were people trying to maintain connection to the reality that existed outside the immediate crisis. She understood that impulse, had learned in her own worst moments that humanity was often preserved in small gestures of normalcy, jokes made while circumstances spiraled toward catastrophe, conversations maintained when silence would have been more efficient. The radio crackled with an update from the operations center. Requiem 11, you're currently 300 nautical miles from Sigonella. Your fuel state suggests you have approximately 15 minutes remaining before emergency fuel state. We've alerted Sigonella to your situation, and they're standing by with emergency equipment. Recommend you begin descent now to optimize glide distance if engine failure occurs. Maya acknowledged and began a shallow descent, the aircraft's nose dropping slightly as she traded altitude for forward momentum, understanding that if the engines quit, she would have perhaps minutes of gliding capability before physics demanded she find somewhere to put the aircraft down. The Mediterranean stretched beneath them, dark water that concealed the violence of its surface in the abstraction that darkness created, beautiful and lethal in equal measure. She thought about ejection, the sequence she had performed once before and remembered with physical memory that transcended conscious recollection, the explosive charges and the rocket motor, and the violent deceleration of parachute deployment, followed by the equally violent impact with whatever surface waited below. Ejection over water in darkness meant significant risk of drowning if she became tangled in parachute shrouds, or if impact injuries prevented swimming, meant that even successful ejection could quickly transform into slow-motion tragedy. Requiem 2, if I have to eject, I need you to maintain position on my chute, she transmitted to Bryce. I'm not letting you ditch, he responded, the swagger notably absent from his voice, replaced with something firmer and more authentic. We're getting both of you to Sigonella. The certainty in his statement would have been comforting if Maya believed certainty meant anything in situations where mechanical systems and physics made the final determination. But she appreciated the sentiment, understood it as the kind of necessary fiction that kept people functioning when acknowledging reality would paralyze action. The fuel gauge touched the red line marking emergency fuel state, and as if the aircraft had been waiting for that specific threshold, the master caution light began flashing, and the port engine fire warning illuminated. I've got a fire warning on the port engine, Maya transmitted, her voice professionally calm while her hands moved across the emergency procedures memorized through countless repetitions. She pulled the port engine throttle to cutoff and activated the fire suppression system, sending halon flooding into the engine compartment to smother whatever combustion had begun. The fire warning light extinguished after several seconds that felt substantially longer, suggesting the halon had successfully suppressed the fire, or that the warning had been triggered by something other than actual combustion. Either way, she now had only one functioning engine and rapidly depleting fuel, both factors that significantly narrowed her options. The single remaining engine kept them airborne but reduced their speed and climb capability, transformed the Warthog from marginally adequate to barely sufficient. Requiem 11 is single engine, she transmitted. Continuing towards Sigonella, but options are becoming limited. 200 nautical miles remaining, the distance that would have been routine minutes ago now representing a gap between current position and safety that seemed to widen rather than close despite forward progress. Maya's eyes moved constantly between instruments and the darkness ahead, searching for any visual reference that would provide confirmation of position beyond the electronic navigation systems she was forced to trust. Requiem, Sigonella Tower has you on radar, the operations center transmitted, the message carrying implications of proximity, suggesting they had closed enough distance that ground-based radar could track their position. They're clearing all other traffic and setting up for your straighten approach. Emergency equipment is positioned and ready. Maya acknowledged, beginning to configure the aircraft for approach while mentally rehearsing the landing sequence with one engine and degraded hydraulics, understanding that the touchdown would need to be precise, because she wouldn't have the power or control authority for a go-around if the first attempt failed. Behind her, Cordell had fallen silent again, perhaps sensing the tension or simply exhausted by the adrenaline crash that followed sustained fear. She could feel his presence, the weight that made the aircraft slightly tail-heavy and affected trim, but the Warthog handled the irregularity with characteristic stability. The runway lights of Sigonella appeared in the distance, a line of white and amber that represented safety if she could reach them before the remaining engine quit or control authority degraded beyond manageable limits. She established the aircraft on final approach, descending through darkness toward the lights that represented the narrow intersection between survival and disaster. The Warthog responded sluggishly to control inputs, the degraded hydraulics requiring larger movements and more conscious attention to achieve the precise control that normal operations made reflexive. Requiem 11 is on final, single engine, gear down and locked, she transmitted, the formal announcement that marked the transition from flight to landing, from dynamic situation to imminent conclusion. The runway grew larger in the windscreen, altitude decreasing with each second, and Maya forced herself to maintain the controlled descent rate despite instinct screaming to get the aircraft on the ground immediately. Precision mattered more than speed in landing, she reminded herself, the lesson learned through training that survived intact even when stress and exhaustion degraded other cognitive functions. She crossed the runway threshold, flared to arrest descent, and felt the main gear contact concrete with a jarring impact that suggested her depth perception had been affected by fatigue. The nose wheel came down hard, testing the gear struts that had already absorbed the punishment of the dirt road landing, and she immediately applied brakes while cutting power to the remaining engine. The Warthog decelerated with grinding reluctance, eating runway distance until finally rolling to a complete stop approximately halfway down the 8,000-foot runway. Maya sat motionless for a moment, hands still on the controls, her mind taking several seconds to process that they were stationary safe. The immediate crisis concluded. The radio erupted with transmissions, tower control directing emergency equipment to their position, operations center requesting status update, but the words seemed distant, filtered through the cognitive fog that followed extreme stress. She took a deliberate breath, the action conscious rather than reflexive, then reached up and pulled her helmet off, feeling the cool evening air against sweat-damp hair. Behind her, Cordell was crying, the sound quiet but unmistakable, the release of emotions he had suppressed during the extraction. Maya didn't comment on the tears, understood they represented normal human response to surviving situations that should have ended differently. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft within seconds, fire crews positioning themselves while a crew chief approached with a ladder. Maya opened the canopy and stood in the cockpit, her legs momentarily unsteady as blood flow adjusted to the position change. She climbed down the ladder with careful precision, each movement deliberate, and only when her boots contacted concrete did she allow herself to acknowledge the profound exhaustion that made standing require conscious effort. Admiral Holt appeared from one of the vehicles, his presence suggesting he had been monitoring the situation and had positioned himself to be present for whatever outcome manifested. He approached Maya where she stood beside the aircraft, his expression unreadable. "Captain Reeves, that was either the most brilliant improvisation I've seen in 30 years or the most reckless violation of operational procedures I'll need to address," he said, the words carrying weight that suggested judgment remained undetermined. Maya met his gaze steadily, too tired for diplomacy or deference. "It was what the situation required, sir." Holt studied her for a long moment, his eyes moving past her toward the damaged aircraft where maintenance personnel were already conducting initial assessment, then back to her face. What he saw there made something shift in his expression, recognition passing behind his eyes. "Show me," he said quietly, the request carrying implications that Maya understood immediately. She hesitated, the instinctive resistance to exposure warring with the understanding that this moment would determine how her actions were classified, whether as heroism or recklessness, competence or liability. She reached down and lifted the lower portion of her flight suit top, revealing the tank top beneath and the scars that decorated her ribs, marks from the Kandahar mission that had transformed Captain Maya Reeves into Requiem. The scars formed patterns that spoke of fragmentation damage and surgical repair, of injuries that should have been fatal but through combination of luck and skill had proven survivable. Holt stared at the scars, his expression transforming from stern authority to something softer, something that contained recognition and perhaps apology for judgments not yet made but contemplated. "Afghanistan," he said, statement rather than question. Maya nodded, pulling her flight suit back into place. "Kandahar 3 years ago. I was the only one who made it back from that mission. 4 other pilots went down, and I spent 36 hours on the ground waiting for extraction that kept not arriving because the tactical situation was too complicated, and the risk assessment said rescue wasn't viable. When they finally sent someone, it wasn't because the situation had improved, it was because someone decided that viable wasn't the same as possible." The words came out flat, emotionless, the recitation of facts that had lost their capacity to generate feeling through repetition and time. Holt absorbed this, his understanding deepening with context. "Requiem," he said quietly, testing the call sign. "They called you that because you wrote the memorial service, because you had to stand in front of families and explain why their sons and daughters and husbands and wives weren't coming home, why you survived and they didn't." Maya nodded, the gesture containing confirmation and the weight of memory that never fully faded. "I decided that day that if I ever had the opportunity to bring someone home, I would take it regardless of risk assessment or operational procedures or career consequences. Lieutenant Cordell has a wife and a child on the way. They get to meet him because tonight, the situation demanded action instead of calculation." Holt stood silent, his expression cycling through emotions that suggested internal debate about regulations versus results, procedures versus outcomes, the eternal tension between the systems designed to protect people and the moments when those systems became obstacles to the protection they purported to provide. Finally, he extended his hand. "Welcome home, Captain," he said, the words carrying weight that transcended simple greeting. Maya shook his hand, feeling the strength in his grip, understanding that in that gesture was acknowledgement, acceptance, and the kind of respect that could only be granted by someone who understood what survival cost when purchased with choices that broke something fundamental in the process. Emergency medical personnel had extracted Cordell from behind the seat and were performing initial assessment, checking for injuries that adrenaline might have masked. He looked over toward Maya as she approached, his expression containing gratitude and something more complex, perhaps the understanding that he owed his life to someone who had already paid prices he was only beginning to comprehend. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate but sincere. Maya nodded, accepting the gratitude without deflecting or minimizing, understanding that he needed to express it, and that diminishing his thanks would diminish what they had both survived. "Take care of your family, Lieutenant," she said simply. "That's the only thanks that matters." The night had grown fully dark now, stars emerging above the airfield with the clarity that Mediterranean skies provided, beautiful and indifferent to the human dramas played out beneath their ancient light. Maya stood looking up at them, feeling exhaustion and relief, and the strange emptiness that followed survival, the cognitive space where fear and adrenaline had lived now vacant and undefined. Over the following days, the story spread through the naval aviation community, with the rapid propagation that characterized events that challenged conventional understanding. The unauthorized landing in hostile territory, the extraction under fire, the damaged aircraft flown hundreds of miles on single-engine and degraded systems. Each element would have been noteworthy independently, but combined into a narrative that seemed more mythology than operational report. Maya found herself called to multiple debriefings, asked to explain her decision-making process and tactical reasoning to audiences that ranged from genuinely curious to overtly skeptical. She answered their questions with the same professional precision she applied to flying, providing facts without embellishment, acknowledging risks without apologizing for accepting them. The official after-action report, when it was finally completed, classified her actions as within acceptable limits of operational initiative given the rapidly evolving tactical situation. Language carefully chosen to neither explicitly endorse nor condemn, leaving space for interpretation that allowed multiple narratives to coexist. But among the pilots who flew the missions that existed in gray spaces, where procedures became suggestions and survival depended on judgment rather than checklists, her reputation shifted. The stories told in ready rooms and officers' clubs began to emphasize different details, moving from skepticism about female pilots in combat to acknowledgement that competence transcended gender, and that requiem represented something fundamental about the profession they had all chosen. Lieutenant Commander Bryce, who had flown wing during the extraction, underwent his own transformation during those days. He sought Maya out in the transient quarters where she was temporarily billeted, knocked on her door with uncharacteristic hesitation, and when she opened it, stood for a moment as if gathering courage. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "I made assumptions about your capabilities based on factors that had nothing to do with skill or experience. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Maya studied him, seeing genuine remorse in his expression, understanding that the mission had forced him to confront beliefs he had held unconsciously. "Apology accepted, Commander," she said, "but understand that your skepticism wasn't unique. It's the baseline assumption I navigate every day, the starting point I have to overcome before any assessment of my actual competence can begin. You got to see evidence that changed your assumptions. Most people don't. They just maintain their baseline and interpret everything I do through that lens." Bryce absorbed this, nodding slowly. "That must be exhausting," he said quietly. Maya smiled slightly, the expression containing acknowledgement of understatement. "It is, but it's also clarifying. Every time I fly, I know exactly what I'm proving and to whom. There's a purity to that which makes the exhaustion tolerable." They stood in silence for a moment, the conversation having reached a natural conclusion but neither quite ready to end it. Finally, Bryce extended his hand, and Maya shook it, the gesture containing mutual respect earned through shared experience rather than granted through assumption. The following weeks brought Maya back to routine operations at Oceana, the rhythm of training flights and maintenance schedules, and the administrative duties that occupied military life, between the moments that tested whether training and discipline had adequately prepared people for chaos. She flew 6